The preliminary report provides alarming statistics in using existing FAA data on the risks at DCA to aviation safety. That data includes, and NTSB provides these numbers. In a 13-year period, not a single month went by without at least one, quote, close call between a helicopter and a commercial jet operating at DCA. Between October 21 and December 24, there were 85 incidents where the lateral separation between a commercial jet and a helicopter was less than 1,500 feet, and the vertical separation was less than 200 feet. And during that same time frame, there were more than 15,000, quote, close proximity events between a helicopter and a commercial airplane. The NTSB findings that it is possible for a helicopter on Route 4 to have as little as 75 feet of vertical separation from airplanes on approach to runway 33. In this early investigation, we have many unresolved questions. Among those for me is, why was the ADSB out not transmitting on the Black Hawk?
As a former Black Hawk pilot myself, and I have flown helicopters out of very congested aircraft at Midway Airport. In fact, I commanded the Midway unit for a number of years. I know how challenging this type of mixed-use airspace can be. There are also questions about ADSB. Why was the helicopter not transmitting ADSB out? Do commercial aircraft need to be equipped with ADSB in? How come so many helicopters are allowed exemptions from the ADSB out requirement at DCA?
The Army's practice of disabling ADSB out is a glaring safety concern.
As we seek answers, the NTSB's preliminary report has alarming facts. First, in the 3-year period leading up to the collision, commercial airplane and helicopters got within 400 feet of each other on 15,214 occasions, within 200 feet on 85 occasions. FAA's air traffic managers approve helicopter route charts annually, so if the data raised questions about the safety of these routes, the ball clearly falls into the FAA's court as to whether to act on this data or make changes where the helicopters can fly in DCA. A helicopter at 200 feet would only have 75 vertical feet separation from an airplane approaching on runway 33. These findings reveal a very systemic issue that demand answers from our witnesses today. Acting Administrator Richelieu, I want to know, why did the FAA not act? Why did the FAA not act on 15,000 reports of dangerous proximity? How were these helicopter routes allowed to remain when alarm bells were literally going off in the towers? This lack of oversight must change. The Army Black Hawk helicopter was not transmitting what is known as ADSB out signal, although we don't know why. What we do know is that the military told our colleagues, House Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton in 2023, that the military operates 100% of its flights in the National Capital Region without this safety technology, 100% of the time. On March 7th, I wrote Secretary Hegseth about this issue for a response, asking to respond by March 21st. I've still heard nothing back. I do not like this silence. It's deafening. General Brahman, I have questions about these policies, especially given that the FAA's 2019 rule stating that the deactivation of the ADSB out technology pursuant to an exemption was not to be routine. Well, the Holmes letter says that not only was it far from routine, 100% of the time operated with this exemption. Acting Administrator Richelieu, your agency gave government airspace users a loophole. What we want to know now is why this was allowed to continue if we had this data and information. And are there any other agencies that are acting with ADSB out that we haven't addressed yet? The FAA rule needs to change. Chair Hamady, I will be asking you about ADS-B requirements. In 2010, the FAA said that it was premature to require this kind of equipment on operators. Yet, at the same time the FAA made that decision, just 2 years earlier, you wrote a letter saying, disagreeing with them, but saying that the conclusion, stating the, quote, the equipage of aircraft with ADBS out in capacity will provide for an immediate, substantial contribution to safety, especially during operations in and around airports. Why did we not listen? 15 years later, commercial aircraft are still not operating with this. If American Airlines regional jet had been equipped with this ADBS it would have been able to receive the Black Hawk's transmission, giving it a better intelligence on positioning. Tim Lilly, the father of the pilot from the commercial craft, who he himself is also a Black Hawk helicopter pilot, and his wife, Sherry, spent many years working at Gulfstream. They know a thing or two about aviation. They gave me a list of actions they hope Congress can take to improve safety. Mr. Chairman, we all need to work together on this critical safety legislation. Legislation to close the ADS-B out loophole, require more commercial jets to have ADS-B in capacity when operating near our nation's busiest airports, and have stronger information sharing between our military and civilian authorities.
For context, Pat 25's unit, the 12th Aviation Battalion, falls under the Army Aviation Brigade, or referred to as the TAB. And that unit has the mission to provide continuous, responsive aviation support to senior military and government leaders to enable continuity of government operations and defense support to civil authorities. The TAB is one of dozens of organizations, both civilian and military, that operates helicopters in the D.C. area. Our aircraft continue to meet all requirements to operate in the national airspace, in Class B airspace, and the helicopter routes in Washington, D.C., and they operate under positive control of flight services when within 30 nautical miles of DCA. Pat 25 was operating out of Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir. The crew of 3 were fully qualified to fly in the local area. The pilot in command, CW2 Andrew Eves, was an instructor pilot. The co-pilot, Captain Rebecca Lobach, was a qualified pilot in command as well, and the crew chief, Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, was a standardization flight instructor. The night of 29 January, Pat 25 was conducting an annual proficiency and readiness test, or APART. And as part of that flight, was approved to operate at contingency locations associated with their directed mission. This has led to questions as to whether Pat 25 was transmitting automatic dependent surveillance broadcast out, or ADS-B out. The specific status of both its operation and functionality is something that is under the investigation of the NTSB. The crew, however, was approved to operate with that capability off in accordance with Army policy. The aircraft transponder, however, was active with Mode 3 Alpha Charlie and Mode S when within the Class B airspace and was emitting all the required information to allow air traffic services and traffic collision avoidance systems to detect and track the aircraft. Army policy does not permit transponder off operations in the national airspace. They do not permit transponder off operations. We've also issued interim guidance to elevate the approval authority to operate ADS-B off. The Army is fully committed to a transparent and collaborative review of the events of 29 January and of all operations in the vicinity of DCA.
To NTSB between, as we've said, between October 2021 and December 2024, there were more than 15,000 instances of commercial aircraft coming close to helicopters. 85 of those had a vertical separation of less than 200 feet. General Brayman, do you know how many of those 85 close calls involved Army helicopters?
Ranking Member Duckworth, we do not.
Can you tell me why that is?
That data in those databases is currently not shared, but certainly the Army is interested in becoming part of an opportunity to share data because that's relevant to our safety as well.
Mr. Rochler, will the FAA commit to sharing that data with the Army?
Yes, ma'am, we will.
Thank you.
We've also asked for that information, and we're going to share it as part of our investigation with all the parties.
Can you speak to if a risk assessment for a particular mission comes in at medium or high risk, how the approval authority of that changes? Because you mentioned the approval authority for the DCA area has been raised higher for ADS-B out, correct?
Yeah, yes, Senator. So all missions go through an initial approval process. So a commander has to authorize a reason for an aircraft to fly. At the completion of that authorization, the crew then assesses all the risks associated, known and expected risks associated with the mission they've been tasked to do. That discussion involves a third party, a senior officer or senior aviator within the organization that then assesses that risk and directs the crew to make any changes to mitigate anything that either that briefing officer understands based on their experience. And then when those things are implemented, it goes back to a commander who must authorize every single flight. So in the occurrence of things like ADS-B out operations, that authority resides with a medium risk authority. So a battalion commander must approve that mission in particular. And in this case, the policy allowed that to be delegated down to a company commander. And they must approve that it meets the standards of the policy completely. We have now elevated that risk to high risk. That requires an 06 commander to approve any mission that has ADS-B off.
On March 1st, multiple commercial aircraft landing at DCA reported receiving a traffic alert collision avoidance system, a TCAS resolution advisories, as they were preparing to land, advising pilots of an impending threat from above and in some cases directing the crews to take evasive action by descending. I think we were all alarmed that just a few weeks after the tragedy, commercial pilots were being told they were at imminent risk of a deadly mid-air collision. It's now come to my attention that these warnings were caused by the Secret Service and the U.S. Navy improperly testing counter-drone technology at DCA. Apparently, the Navy was using the same spectrum band as TCAS, causing the interference and faulty resolution advisories, even though the FAA had previously warned the Navy and the Secret Service against using that specific spectrum band due to interference risks. We asked you specifically, how frequently does the Army turn off ADS-B out transmission?
Chairman Cruz, as I stated in the discussion about how we approve the missions, a mission would have to fall into the category as defined in the federal regulation and Army policy. It must have national security implications and be sensitive in nature to be able to do that mission.
General, you're not answering my question. My question is, how frequently is ADS-B out turned off? I wasn't asking what the standard is. I was asking the frequency.
I can take the number for record, Senator, but I can tell you the types of missions, and the majority of the missions they fly are missions associated with that national security mission.
Is it accurate that ADS-B out is turned off for 100% of missions flown by the Army Air Brigade at Fort Belvoir?
Senator, I think you're referring to the June 8th letter from the Joint Staff to Representative Norton. In the context of missions, meaning the operations that the 12th Aviation supports in their mission requirements, I would say that's an accurate statement. I would not say that's an accurate statement of 100% of the flights being flown by that organization.
Okay, so I want to understand what you mean by missions. Does missions capture training flights?
Only training flights that would have been operating in a location that's sensitive as part of their continuity of government operations.
Well, that would be all of them around DCA, is that correct?
Only specific sites that are part of that continuity of government operation.
In your one-pager, you said 75% of the flights are mission rehearsal readiness flights. Are those operated with ADS-B out?
They are, Senator, yes.
So right now, today, the Army is flying helicopters in and around DCA Airport with ADS-B out turned off. Is that correct?
When conducting their NORTHCOM directed mission, that is correct.
I have to say I find that shocking and deeply unacceptable. And I want to encourage the Army right now to revisit that policy and to revisit that policy today. And I can tell you, if the Army chooses not to, I have a high level of confidence that Congress will pass legislation mandating that you revisit the policy. if today another accident occurs over DCA with another helicopter that had ADS-B out turned off, the Army will have very direct responsibility for that. And I am at a loss to come up with any justification for risking the lives of the traveling public with that decision. You can't change the decisions made yesterday, but you can change decisions made forward. Now, it's my understanding the Army has a memo, August 9th, 2024, entitled ADS-B Out Off Operations in the National Airspace. My staff requested that memo from you, and my understanding is your team declined to provide it. That is also unacceptable. I want to ask you at this hearing, will you commit to providing that memo to this committee?
Senator, I'll commit to reviewing the information and getting what we can to you. Absolutely.
That answer needs to be a yes, that you will provide that memo to this committee.
Senator, we'll review that and we'll look at the ability to give it to the committee. Absolutely.
If it is not provided to this committee within 24 hours, I am confident that you will have a senior commanding officer give you a direct order to provide that committee, provide that memo to this committee. And I just want to underscore, there's no reason the Army has to wait for the conclusion of the NTSB report to revisit your policy on ADS-B out. You can do so right now. And I got to tell you, I spent this morning looking in the eyes of family members who lost family members. I don't know how I would do it tomorrow to another room of family members who lost loved ones because yet another helicopter was flying with ADS-B out. And so I cannot urge you more strongly, change that policy right now.
But I want to go back because, Brigadier General, you mentioned in your testimony, we now have the additive dialogue that we just heard, but you said it's not allowed. You're saying it's not allowed. ADBS out was not allowed. That's what you said earlier. Is that in your testimony? In addition to the Holmes letter, you basically stated that using ADBS out, it's not like it was it was not allowed.
Army policy is ADS-B out is not to be used for routine use.
Okay, so acting administrator, did you know this? Did the FAA know this? Did the FAA know and understand and absorb this? Did you know that you were allowing a flight to go within 75 feet of each other and there was no signaling message that we have already identified as a safety measure is something that we have had as a requirement?
So I understand the FAA was aware of this. We have an existing memorandum of agreement with the Department of Defense.
Did you know it was 100%, as the Eleanor Holmes Norton, and as the Brigadier General is pretty clear this morning, we don't allow it, even to the point of not answering Senator Cruz when they're going to change it, because I'm pretty sure their attitude is going to be, we don't allow it. He's going to say he would rather have a route somewhere where he can fly without it. That's what he's going to say. And so, you know, that's a separate issue over here. Our job, though, is the FAA oversight, and you can't give exemptions to things that you don't understand. And so he, in their application, kind of made it sound like, well, it's not going to be that routine, but he's very clear. They're never turning it on if they don't have to. They're never turning it on. So what I don't understand is why the FAA didn't understand that. Why you would allow this design. This is the wrong design. Whoever said you could fly in this airspace this close together without a safety feature that was already being required by the FAA and then giving them an exemption makes no sense. So why did you allow it to happen?
So I can't speak to why the previous administration may have allowed for that memorandum of agreement, which is why we, effective today, will require in any DCA Class B airspace, ADS-B out to be turned on, except in very limited circumstances.
What are those other limited circumstances?
So that
other
would,
agencies? Is there any other agency that's doing this?
So that we have 46 different helicopter operators within the National Capital Region. But again, DCA Class B airspace will now require ADS-B on to be out.
What other agencies are operating this way?
So we have certainly a number of military units. We have local law enforcement. We certainly have the Department of Justice and FBI. We have a number of different agencies that fly the the Park Police, and those are the entities that we're working with closely now to make sure, first and foremost, they understand the new restrictions that we have in the airspace.
Do they have exemptions?
Some of them do.
Are you concerned about this?
Absolutely, which is why we immediately put in place the requirement to have ADSB out on.
And so you think they're operating that way?
Yes, ma'am.
You think that Homeland Security is operating that way?
They are operating, effective today, they will be operating with ADSB.
Effective today?
Yes, ma'am.
So for the last month, you've known, as I am going to submit for the record, a letter from the Department of Homeland Security that basically says, under the federal aviation waiver, all U.S. Custom and Border Protection, air and marine operations in the capital region basically have this exemption as well.
So they haven't had.
So I want to understand, if people were
Sure.
still flying in this airspace, we all fly in and out of this airspace.
Right.
Do we now have to worry about other operators in this airspace that may be doing the same thing as happened with the military?
So
And
I
now
should-
you're telling me you're going to take action today.
I should clarify, immediately after the accident, we put the restrictions in place so that no mixed traffic could occur. No helicopters and fixed wing in the same airspace. Today, we're requiring the ADSB out to be on. So previous to this day, the fixed wing as well as helicopters were not allowed in the airspace. So we cleared the complexity of that airspace.
Now today, you're going to say to Homeland Security, you have to have ADBS, basically the automatic surveillance broadcast system has to be on. You're going to make that today.
That's correct.
Well, I
For
would.
any of the Class B airspace that you can see in the graphic, in that red airspace, that's required.
Acting Administrator, you're not building faith in this system of oversight of the FAA if you're telling me that we now have a bunch of other operators in this airspace that you now said after the accident were prohibited, but now you're going to turn it back on, and if they meet this requirement. And we have letters from them thinking that they're exempted. I want to see this rule. This would have been a great debate with Mr. Bradbury before the committee, because the American people, these poor families have lost loved ones. This is not their day job. It is your day job. It is the day job of the FAA not to allow these exemptions to become prolific and everybody use them, and then us have to sit here and figure out how to do our oversight job of you to make sure that these details are exposed, when we can't even get a memo from some of these agencies. So, Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, but I will come for a second round with the witnesses, because I think it's clear. The NTSB has been very clear on the requirements for ADSB in, and in this case, if they would have listened to them, it's $40,000 to equip, $20,000 to equip one plane. You could probably equip the whole fleet of aviation for $100 million. I guarantee you their lives, the family lives, are worth that.
Please.
There is a DC helicopter working group that we have been trying to figure out who is part of the working group and get minutes and get documents from that working group to see what information was shared and what was discussed over the years. We have not been able to attain that yet, and I hope we can from FAA and others.
Are you a part of that working group?
We are not part of that working group.
But you have access to it, and they are willing to provide what they find.
We have requested information. We have not even been able to identify who is part of the working group firmly and get documents as part of that working group. We've requested all of that information because we do want to evaluate what was discussed. We're also going to interview the FAA cartographers on how this route was mapped, because that 75 feet is max. That is the maximum. It goes down from there as the glide slope comes down to, as commercial aircraft approach runway 33.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can help Senator Hamady, Chairman Hamady.
That's a very hard job, no.
You are very good at public relations with senators, that we recognize the challenges you face. So do either one of you belong to this working group? Does the Army or the FAA participate? And can you answer that so the NTSB can pursue information?
I mean, the FAA, it's the FAA's working group.
It's the FAA's working group. All right. Mr. Rushlow, what's the problem?
I'm happy to work with the chair. We've been working extremely closely together on this investigation, and I'm happy to work with the chair and understand why she hasn't received that information and make sure we follow up on that.
Can you think of any reason that NTSB shouldn't be a part of that information?
Off the top of my head, I can't. I don't know why they would be restricted in that, and I certainly will talk to my folks when we get back.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Chairman, should we ask is the Army part of this working group as well?
The Army is part of the working group. Yes, Senator.
There are apparently 17 entities that are part of the working group. We just haven't been able to verify who all the entities are.
Surely the FAA is in charge, and they can help you.
Surely I would have been happy to understand that before today and work
General,
with
you
the
know any
chair.
reasons that the working group's efforts can't be known by NTSB?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Let me follow up. Mr. Rochelow indicated that the FAA does have the authority to require ATSB out. Do you agree with that assessment that the FAA can make this decision, and if you don't follow the FAA policies, then you're precluded from the airspace?
Chairman, the Army operates 100% under FAA authority.
For this accident helicopter, no ADSB data had been received from an FAA ground station for 730 days prior to the accident, and that was abnormal. So we began looking at the fleet for the battalion. The battalion had 25 helicopters. That includes this particular helicopter. 9 of them were Mike models, and all were transmitting ADSB out when they were turned on, because we have to verify that it's working. There were 16 Limas, including the accident helicopter, which we're still looking at, but 7 were transmitting when ADSB out was turned on. 8 were not, and stopped doing so sometime between May and November 2023. We don't know why. 5 of those started transmitting since the NTSB identified the issue and began working with the Army to try to isolate the reason. So I just want to let you know that you can have ADSB out on, but you also have to make sure that it's working.
You indicated working with the Army, but there's other participants in this arena.
Absolutely.
And then were you narrowing it to the Army as if something is necessarily wrong there? Or more broadly, there's a problem in receiving the information?
For this, for the ADSB out on, we wanted to look at the helicopter fleet for the battalion to see if whether ADSB out on, when turned on, was actually transmitting data. Because we did think it was abnormal that for the helicopter involved in the accident, it wasn't transmitting data for so long.
Any explanation, General?
Chairman, this exactly is what the value of the investigation is. There are things that you would not normally look at that are being determined here, and that's certainly going to help us drive policy and any changes that we need to do as a result of the investigation. And certainly the NTSB has the expertise to do that.
So what we're hearing from Chair Hamady is that there may be, it may be transmitting, it may be on, but there's no receipt. There's, I don't know, technical problems in the process by which it's not providing the information it's supposed to provide, right?
Chairman, obviously the functionality of any Army equipment, it's certainly Army aviation equipment, is important to me. So if we're discovering that there's a challenge there, we will take direct action, absolutely.
This is not an inconsequential thing, right?
No, it's not. Okay. And I think for the public watching, because I think there are a lot of people watching, is ADSB out broadcasts latitude, longitude, and altitude and velocity once per second. It updates once per second versus 4 to 6 seconds for radar, which is significant when you have converging aircraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on what Chairwoman Hamidi is talking about, testing the ADS-B out, whether it's actually transmitting data, because the data was not received. Will we be able to check that with all of the other rotary wing operators that are in this region as well? Or is that something the FAA should be mandating? Is that they could do that? I mean, you're not looking at the other operators because they're not part of this accident, correct? So then my question for Mr. Rushlow is, will you be directing, will the FAA be directing all of the other helicopter operators, whether it's Homeland Security, local law enforcement, who have this exemption to ADS-B out, will you be directing that they actually test their equipment to make sure that it is actually transmitting the data that can be received?
Yes, Senator, I think that's part of our ongoing work in the collaboration between those operators and how we make sure they, first and foremost, understand the requirement, and second, that their equipment is functional.
Okay, thank you.
The senator from Illinois was asking about routine maintenance and determining whether equipment is working. You have a standard in place that what Chairwoman Hamidi said, it doesn't make sense to me that you wouldn't know there were problems with the transmission or the equipment. Do you have a protocol in place and that equipment inspected on a continuing basis?
Certainly, Chairman, with general aviation operations, we have protocols for the status of aircraft. I will have to get back to you and take it for the record on what the protocol is to ensure that ADS-B out transmissions outside of the aircraft are being received. It's something I'll have to look on. How do we do that?
And whether protocol is being followed.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just the report, the statistics of the number of near misses between helicopters and aircraft landing at DCA, that, you know, those operations now have been halted. Can you just explain to the American people why that didn't happen before?
So, again, I'll say that the reports that were come in previously were certainly analyzed, but something was missed. And since that time, we've been using new tools available to us, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to scan the tens of millions of data points, to be able to do that analysis in a more proactive and ideally at some point here predictive way to head off, to identify risk earlier and to mitigate that risk.
But this wasn't a new issue at DCA, right? This is an issue that had been a longstanding concern. Is that accurate?
It's accurate. There were a number of reports that came in, and I would say that we've, as I mentioned earlier, we investigate every single near mid-air collision, and even as we talk about spectrum issues, Chairman Cruz mentioned, we have teams that go out and assess the airspace itself, making sure that we're working with partners, whether it's on counter-UAS technology, to make sure that airspace is as clean as possible from interference. In the graphic, I can explain that in the yellow sectioned area, the graphic there, that is where there is no mixed traffic. No helicopters, no fixed wing, except for those very few circumstances where we have emergency national security type of traffic. In the red section, in that red airspace, is where ADS-B out, so DCA Class B airspace, is now required. You'll also notice where, based on the NTSB recommendations, where we've eliminated Route 4 down going north to south on the Potomac, as well as Route 6 that formerly, you can see on the left side of the graphic, was in effect between from the west to the east, where Bolling Air Force Base is.
I'll have to think about that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, just for the record, because I see we have several
Senator Cantwell,
colleagues.
you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify on your point, Acting Administrator, we still have a rule that says they have an exemption, all sensitive. So I know you're making a declaration today, but I don't think that supersedes the rule. Now, maybe President Trump's going to call all these agencies and tell them to stand down, but legally, whatever the FAA is doing today doesn't take precedent over that rule. So when I come back for a second round,
I believe the FAA has control over that airspace, and they can say.
they can definitely shut it down, but as it relates to the rule, his decision just to say that you now have this requirement that a rule gave them an exemption to.
I think he can issue an emergency directive. Is that correct?
So it's the agreement we have in place with the helicopter operations that fly without ADSB out is an actual memorandum of agreement. It is not a formal rule. So it's an agreement we have with the Department of Defense and the other helicopter operators in the DC area.
And we can get a copy of that, the MOU? Thank you.
I mean, one thing I will mention that we haven't talked about that we are looking at as part of this investigation is our longstanding belief that ADSB in also needs to be mandated by the FAA. We don't know what relevance that has to this investigation yet. However, it is a longstanding position of the NTSB. It will provide key information to pilots. And in 2008, in our comments for a notice of proposed rulemaking to FAA, where they decided not to require it, we said equipage of aircraft with ADSB and capability will provide an immediate and substantial contribution to safety. Just a couple of years ago, and we just talked about Alaska, we investigated a midair collision in Ketchikan, and we reiterated, and this is the statement, that NTSB remains concerned that without a requirement to install and use ADSB supported airborne traffic advisory systems, mid-air collisions will continue to occur. And that was in 2019.
Okay. The fact that ADSB out, there's evidence that the transmissions were not received, and apparently the Army doesn't know that they weren't received. Why doesn't the FAA know they're not received?
I'm not aware of that. I know it's a part of the ongoing investigation. I don't believe that we receive any helicopter information from the Army.
But somebody has to be reporting that they were sent but not received. Who do they report that to?
Again, I think that's part of the investigation. My assumption would be the Army.
Okay.
Well, no. The Army could have it turned on, but I think what the chairwoman is saying is that the receiving station got no data, so the Army has got it turned on, and they don't know that it's not receiving. So this is, again, this communication issue between the different agencies.
Right. Talking about whether we're willing to change the policy, the Army's policy, the Army is always willing to review its policy. Am I prepared to make a decision on ADSB out right now? No, Senator, but I want to do that informed by the facts that we have in this investigation, and those will drive policy changes. And that is not the Army policy, that's DOD policy, and the Army certainly has a vested interest in getting it right. But at the end of the day, what I'm most concerned about is the rigid application of that policy, that it's being done correctly and not being abused. And that is part of this investigation as well.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are you now supportive of ADSB in as a requirement? Making sure that carriers like this regional jet, again, I mentioned earlier, it's $20,000 or so per plane. Why can't we just say we're going to do this?
I did understand from the chair earlier that it's been an ongoing recommendation. I have not personally looked into that in the last 2 months as to what the expectations are on ADSBN. I know that equipage on aircraft throughout the system can be challenging, but I certainly will take that back and look into it to figure out what specifically ADSBN would be, what would be required to mandate that. Certainly, if Congress passes a law, we would, as we did with...
We already did, by the way, we already did. It was called the reauthorization bill. And as I said in my opening statement, we basically authorized spending for this through the equipage program. And, you know, you can discuss how this actually gets deployed, but I'm pretty sure the consumer ends up paying for it regardless in some way. And so the point is, NTSB has been recommending this. Is that right, Chairwoman?
That's correct.
You've recommended this since 2008?
And I have to look, but I think we actually have recommendations on ADSB in that precedes that. That was, those were comments, and if I may I add our 2008 comments to the hearing record? Thank you.
Without objection.
So I think, Acting Administrator, I think we need to hear from the Department of Transportation and the FAA that they understand that these recommendations have been on the table and you need to respond to them. We don't want to do that. We don't want to keep doing this, which is having one organization who has to investigate all the accidents, deal with all the families, deal with the grief and emotion, and then have an FAA that gets too cozy with industry and gives them exemptions. We don't want that. And so what we want is you to listen to the NTSB. And I know this is historic. I'm not blaming any administration. It's historic. It's historic. As long, it's been there since the beginning of the big crashes that we've had, way before the MAX, where the FAA makes safety recommendations and then they're ignored for like, oh, I don't know, sometimes a decade. And then people finally say, oh, okay. But we owe it to these families. We owe it to them now. It's not that hard to get this done. So I hope you will take this back to the Secretary, have an internal discussion, and basically agree it's time to get this done. Yes.
And if I may add, and we're going to look at this as part of our investigation to see how it could have factored in, but the CRJ had ADSB out. It did not have ADSB in. And so we are going to look at what that information could have provided to that flight crew and how it could have made a difference. We've seen that in other investigations, which is why we have these recommendations.